Shiva's creation is perfect. It's perfect to the degree that it allows Shiva to experience itself through infinite point of view. So each and every one of us could be seen as that particularly unique POV. You see? So therefore, concessionally speaking, we speak of this as individual effort. We apply that individual effort. But if you give that elevated perspective, instantly you will have to recognize that that is still not individual pertaining as individual walking around with its own individual agencies, independent from the overall, let's say, plan, plot, call it whatever, lila, cosmic play, right? Play of consciousness. So let's just maybe go over some of the basics of this really, really clear that the movements themselves, right, what we have defined in this work as Samavesha, and more specifically at times as Samavesha Kriya. And remember, I've mentioned that we use the term Samavesha with regard to three aspects of what that term stands for and represents in a given tradition. Samavesha as immersion. So in other words, Samavesha as an immersion into the Shiva's consciousness. Samavesha as penetration. In other words, it is when Samavesha spoken with regard to the agency of what in charge of a particular phase of the process. And they are respectively two principal penetrations, really. The penetration, as it were, of individualized consciousness upwards, right? And as an opposite to that movement is a penetration of the transcendental in its motion downwards. We are not going to go into these specifics now. I'm just giving it an overview so that you allocate the term penetration. It's literally penetration into the higher state of consciousness. So any of you who have done meditation for a number of years, particularly if you have studied meditation from proper sources, not just online, even though I'm sure there's plenty of very credible sources available online these days. I belong to the older generation when meditations were taught in person. And that was important value of that. Those know that there are these experiences when through the individual effort, maybe we can speak about it as a sum total of our discipline, commitment, right? The kind of infused with some bit of faith into that, what we give ourselves. We access higher consciousness. So that would be that upward moving penetration, as it were done by each and every one of us through individual efforts. So this is the upward penetration into the higher state of consciousness. Not the highest, higher. And as an opposite to that, there is the penetration downwards. This is the grace descending penetration. You see? It's a grace descending movement. That grace descending movement is literally what we could spoken of as a two-way process. It is through the individual effort we rise, and when we, as it were, exhausted our individual effort, our effort cannot take us any further than the downward penetration takes place, and that is the Samavesha known as Shiva Samavesha. So there are three types of penetration, though I just spoke of two. And the second penetration is the Shakto Samavesha, is that you can allocate now into that equilateral, that triangle, to understand how it functions here. Individual awareness, you and I, let's say speak in that manner, each and every one of us exemplifies that Shiva consciousness in its individualized aspect. Okay? And the enchantment is real. If it was not real, every one of us would see through instantly. Just give a little more attention and you will penetrate, as it were. You will see through the matrix. But you cannot. Can you see through the illusion? If you see through the illusion, illusion is not perfect. That's what I would say. There's a glitch. It starts to pixelate. Is anything pixelating? Am I pixelating now when you look at me? I can see everyone clearly. Okay, if I take off my glasses, you'll be more fuzzy, but doesn't mean you're pixelated. You're still, you know. This is the beauty of Māyā. This is the beauty of this phenomenal reality. It is not less divine and it's not less magical, not less awesome than the Godhead, herself, himself, itself. If you reflect on why that is, then in no time you will arrive simply by mere inference why that is. Why that is. In a way, it's a reconfirmation of the almighty potential, that what is represented here by Shiva consciousness. So Shiva's creation is perfect. It's perfect to the degree that it allows Shiva to experience itself through infinite point of view. So each and every one of us could be seen as that particularly unique POV. You see? So therefore, concessionally speaking, we speak of this as individual effort. We apply that individual effort. But if you give that elevated perspective, instantly you will have to recognize that that is still not individual pertaining as individual walking around with its own individual agencies, independent from the overall, let's say, plan, plot, call it whatever, lila, cosmic play, right? Play of consciousness. And yet we still speak about it with reference to, and this will become clearer when we yet give the crash discourse on methodologies applied. Because the Kashmir Shaivism is very precise when it comes to methodology. And the methodology here rests around the means, applicable means, and they are unique when it comes to this particular system. Unique. And understanding that will make you masters of your own processes, literally, not metaphorically. Because if you don't understand what is at play, there is always this vagueness, always this sort of like guessing, floating somewhere. Like, what's at play, what's at work, what's in charge, who's in charge. So going back to the Samavesha as penetration, that's what it exemplifies. So individual consciousness penetrates into Shakti. And from Shakti consciousness, it penetrates into Shiva consciousness, or Shiva descends, as it were, and meets himself, itself, halfway through. So that is the grace descending power of Shiva. It's very important not to confuse this particular, what we're now discussing, with the often goes around term Shaktipat. In Kashmir Shaivism, it's very, very precise. It's a philosophy, it's methodology, it's way of life, and of course it owns a lot to various different systems because it's incorporated all into itself. It's not the Shaktipat, often spoken in various other tantras or in yoga, right? Which basically the transmission of power, Shaktipat or Shaktipata. Yes, of course, there is a very, very lucid elaboration on that in its own terms, and who can be the carrier of that, and how Shaktipat can be received. But in terms of the Samavesha, it's something else here. It's a literally descent of grace. So due to our effort, we could say that, again, it's a concession in the language, we rise in consciousness. And then the job is completed by the higher power, because we cannot progress from that place by individual means. Why? Because the individual means exhaust themselves there and then. Do you see? They are no longer operable. This will become clear when we speak about upayas, means, with which Kashmir Shaivism defines the very essence of spiritual unfoldment. Okay? And finally, Samavesha as repossession or possession per se. It's the most uneasy, perhaps controversial aspect of what Samavesha here represents in Tantras, and it goes back to 1,000 years, to the times of 10th century sage Abhinavagupta, who had rescued that term from it being associated with negative connotations, particularly in ongoing intellectual, let's say, battles with other systems prevalent at the time in India, that of Shaiva Advaita. It is, for those of you, just for a general interest, in the landscape of India, the rise of Kashmir Shaivism, right, as it is popularly known, Trika Shaivism, coincided with widely spread popularity of Advaita Tantra. Siddhanta school is known. It was dualistic, but there are two schools of Siddhanta, or Shaiva Siddhanta. There's the non-dual and dual. And in its discourses, Abhinavagupta delivered unapologetic critical assessments of the Shaiva Siddhanta and its limitations, and exalted the superiority of Trika Shaivism over the Siddhanta, and managed to drive these schools away, just as 2 centuries before that, the aforementioned Adi Shankara drove away any remnants of Madhyamika Buddhism from India. Because that was the job of Adi Shankara, to rid India of any influences associated with Buddhism. It is just for further interests, for you to understand, let's say, the overall landscape, the repercussions. And also it would be understandable why certain, let's say, expositions, teachings, like particularly Viveka Chudamani, the text that Adi Shankara authored, has this unapologetically bitey, critical assessments of what was prevalent around. It's like continuously, he stings very painfully, like bites it, like he destroys, demolishes any argument with counter-argument just to prove his points. So Samavesha, prior to the way it was incorporated by the Shaivites of the Trika school, was considered to be as associated with dangerous connotations, that of possession by negative forces, possessions by entities. Hence, the term Samavesha had this, let's say, negative connotations. And Abhinavagupta takes this and gives this proper shake-up of what the actual term truly represents in terms of consciousness itself. And he posits something extraordinary, something that if any of you have visited our website dedicated to, we started our own publishing house, right, last year, 2 years ago, to coincide with the release of the first book, Chamatkara, The Hidden Path, second project in the making now, due to be released, Kundalini, and the third is dedicated already to Samavesha, particularly with an emphasis on these three aspects, where possession will be given a proper overview. So possession, as Abhinavagupta argued, so as to rescue that term, is in the very nature of consciousness. In other words, if you analyze it attentively, we all are possessed by some qualities, to whatever degrees, because that's in the nature of consciousness. This possession takes place in a variety of ways. Yes, of course, possession can be spoken chiefly in terms of being possessed by a particular entity. Let's say being possessed by a particular illness. And that illness will begin to display itself depending what area it will attack, right? We can even speak about cancer as a form of possession. It enters the body, right? Sneaks in from behind the scenes, and then it begins to destroy the host. It begins to destroy the very cells at which expense it exists. It's a very, very unusual phenomena of how cancer functions. And what is more unusual is that the cells surrounding cancer do everything to propitiate and support this invasion. Why? Because they're programmed, or our cells programmed, to work in such way that whatever nearby cells happen to be, we supposed to cooperate. So I'll share whatever I have. I'll give my goodness, whilst being at the very same time consumed nevertheless by that invasion. You see? It's like neighbor moves into your street right next door to you, just giving an example, and has very malicious intentions. And you are, like helping with this, that, right? And in no time, you're being pushed out of your own nest, kind of thing. Anyways, psychic disturbances of all kinds, various kinds, these psychic disturbances also could be due to a certain, let's say, possession by an entity. And that possession creates havoc because this possession would be considered malignant if that entity belongs to that, let's say, malignant scope of energies. So it will again live at the expense, at first coexisting with the host. And there is a very, very unusual process happens, studied today in clinical psychology, in transpersonal psychology, let's say, how trauma displays itself. I will just share with you briefly this, so as not to take us on a detour, but because it's a very fitting example when we speak about this. For example, trauma, particularly if received at a very early stage or age in life, can be so incorporated in the sense of our identity that it is unimaginable for us to live without that trauma, because that trauma would mean, like parting with that trauma would literally mean amputating an important part of our psychic setup. This is very difficult to deal with, because it's not something that one witnesses as, let's say, and recognizes as traumatic experience which simply laid an imprint an imposition on our psyche and likewise here on our sense of well-being. And one understands that one is better off. Another matter is if it's difficult to rid of that trauma, let's say like post-traumatic disorders, PTSD, right? There is this definitive imprint left by being exposed to jolting, life-threatening experiences, of witnessing that, or being part of that. And of course, it's like one knows that one is better off that, but it's easier said than done. But you see, this is just an imprint. One does not consider oneself to be inherently embedded with the personality of that what trauma represents. Much more difficult when trauma is incorporated into our identity complex. So in other words, parting with trauma, parting with a chunk of ourself. And we don't even know what chunk we're parting with, because it's precious. It's precious. Why is it precious? Well, because we've managed to incorporate that into our identity. It doesn't matter how lopsided it may be at a psychic level. I got used to it. I accommodated that. It's me, it's part of me. I don't want to be without it, or I don't know how to be without it. More likely, it leaves a void. It leaves a kind of space which feels very, very eerie and uncomfortable. So in terms of Samavesha, with regard to the possession by entity, there are stages of incorporation. When that entity cohabits in the host, with the host, it, one could say, is half the problem. But when it merges with the host, as in some cases, then this is considered to be a very much more difficult, advanced cases. You see? So what is even more fascinating, that in Indian spirituality, particularly in rural spirituality, not the academies, not, let's say, the spiritual centers, but more in the rural areas where certain very ancient forms of spirituality were practiced, very much on par with shamanic practices, which could be considered to be the first spiritual practices ever, shamanic practices, right? When human beings, us as earthlings, we lived in such proximity with nature, we lived in nature and as nature. So therefore, there has always been this constant balancing act, constant paying the taxes in that kind of, like, if we use that language. We were constantly engaged in that symbiotic relationship, which required not just, let's say, survive and conquer, as later would appear to be the more of a kind of modus operandi, but more so to be able to live through a particular season, live through a particular, let's say, more demanding time, when the dependence on whatever is planted, harvested, whatever is foraged, whatever is hunted, depends on that symbiotic relationship. So the shamanic forms of spirituality was constant invocation and constant, the term just like alludes me, this more fitting word, not a bargain, not striking a bargain, but finding that way where one can coexist, very often at the expense of sacrificial offerings. So the sacrificial offerings will reassure something is done at a subtle level. Some energies are appeased. And appeasing these energies, one would feel psychically free and psychically also legitimate to enter a certain contract where it is required for one's survival, which will be at the cost of members of the species that live nearby. Far picture from just hunting the mammoth and, killing it in And just this is very, very primitive perspective given on the ancient affairs of the man. There are much more interesting perspectives now coming to light, but we are not to discuss this. So in the rural areas of India, Samavesha survived to this day, where possession by a deity is being used as a recovery from a possession by an entity. You see? So in other words, if someone suffering from, like, let's say, a boy, a girl, and teenagers we know are much more susceptible, the teenagers, why? The age of puberty, this young age, because the psyche is in the most vulnerable state. It's no longer a child and not an adult. So one is more susceptible to, let's say, energetic invasion, let's put it this way. Is being, let's say, afflicted by some invasion, then it would be given to a deity to perform an act of repossession. It is very much in line to how Abhinavagupta rescued the very term Samavesha as the highest form of spiritual transformation. And in doing so, he did tremendous favor and tremendous service, because otherwise that and these practices were kind of abandoned and were considered to be not worthy of a, let's say, more proper spiritually savvy communities, because of its associations with being possessed by an entity, entities of all sorts, various kinds. But here, the argument, the main argument, is that it's in the very nature of consciousness. So the act of possession always taking place. So in a way, in our day and age, when maybe speaking of entities outside of these tribal societies is less legit or less maybe relevant, we can still be possessed by other forms that turn themselves into archetypal forms, or at least being fed by certain archetypal forces. We can be possessed by anything that we think it's just a topic of our interest, subject of our curiosity. And in no time, we become sucked into the energetic vortex of that, where we're simply being taken. And all this is energy, like Tantra is all energy, everything is energy. And energy is indestructible. Energy can only be transformed, never destroyed, never disposed, never chucked away, never flushed out, flushed down. It can only be transformed. So we are this, according to a tantric understanding, walking vortexes of energy. And within that, there are these potential afflictions where some areas begin to dominate our psyche. We can see this at the collective level, of which is already by now have been spoken. We're just adding the voice to that. We've been speaking about it now into a few years, that how the collective consciousness is afflicted by certain tendencies. And these tendencies can be seen literally as collective forms of possession. There are some enormous cases of that which have been observed, let's say, on the level of when the whole nation can be possessed, as it happened not far from here, right? When in the center of Europe, in the most arguably civilized, intellectually charged, with a great history culture, something as Nazism took place and has turned itself into what we know it. So this also can be seen as a form of a global possession. Possession when it afflicts the whole nation with its ideology. So we should not shy away from speaking about this, because I speak about it openly today. In our day and age, Zionism is another form of a possession, which takes masses, particularly even among the educated, among the people who are in power, This is not the simple folk, villages who are being indoctrinated, right? That ideas of supremacy, the ultimate supremacy, supremacy of one's right at birth to be supreme. It's dangerous. Dangerous. It's literally an affliction. It's like a kind of very powerful psychic interference in the collective consciousness. So we could, of course, see ourselves that well, that doesn't concern me, you know, but the world is much more interconnected. Much more interconnected. We are all entangled in certain ways. You know? The great champion of Palestinian rights, Norman Finkelstein, whose name came now to prominence since the events, most recent events in the last 2 years in Gaza. Who has heard that name, Norman Finkelstein? Nobody? Okay, some people heard. Well, he's been like, you know, all his life he's dedicated his life in service of justice, let's put it that way. And he's been an open critic of Zionism and the policy of Israel and towards Palestinians. Recently I came across one of his videos where he speaks about Hollywood. And it's an astounding number of films were made and perpetually, continuously made, where the ideas of the Holocaust are constantly running through so that people of every generation grow up with the understanding and knowledge of that. And yet not a single movie is made about Palestine. Movie, featured movie. Not one movie. And as an apartheid system, Palestine has been subdued and subjugated by Israel for how many years? Anyone knowledgeable about history? How many years? Come on, folks. Huh? No, that's Balfour Agreement. Yeah, this Balfour Agreement, it's already before. 76 years, right? 76 years of a systematic occupation, deportation, and extinction of people, of one nation against another. You can't even call them, like you can't call Palestinians Zionists, because it's like you can't even mention certain things. It's illegal in Israel. You will end up immediately in jail there and then, just by using certain words. Certain words are considered, a single word is considered to be illegal to use out loud, publicly. You may want to think that term. The technology doesn't exist yet to penetrate your thoughts. But the word Nakba has legal repercussions. If you say Nakba somewhere, you can be arrested and thrown into jail. It is in constitution. Why? Because Nakba translates as disaster. Disaster. From the group of languages that people speak there. Nakba. Why are we speaking about this? It's very important to understand what the scope of Samavesha and what we speak of when we speak of possession. People ask me from the start of this work, from get-going, you know, particularly those who have certain, let's say, history of, like, you know, uneasiness. People came into this work also feeling that they have an entity. In some cases it was true. In some cases people came into this work whilst being invaded by some kind of psychic entities, which had to be exercised out of them. In other cases it was more of an imaginary something that was also has been related to them, that perhaps this is not so. But the point is here is that possession is alive and kicking, and we are always being possessed by some qualities. By some qualities, and when these qualities begin to be shared by enough people, it creates enough resonance. enough resonance, enough power goes there. Resources, forces, you see? So how people can be consumed, of course, how our consciousness above all else can be consumed, there is no end to it. It's not all that straightforward. And it's not all that kind of like an easy peasy cake, right? Like we might believe that it is. When it comes to consciousness, it is very good to understand that certain cultures dedicated uninterrupted investigation into this for millennia. They've made it into their raison d'etre of cultural, let's say, priority. So, back to where I've started now, just to give this. Movements in a room are not the goal. It's very, very clear. The movements. And the sounds. Particularly when this is understood to be part and parcel of the process of unwinding and freeing the system from accumulated, let's say, information. Whatever that information is or was. Accumulated in this life, in previous life. We can do something for a long time in a gestural manner, in the way the body expresses itself, or in terms of how we express ourselves vocally, simply because certain tendencies laid an imprint deep enough, including some of the desires, intentions, unfulfilled aspirations. Just to give an example, you wanted to be a dancer in your past life, for instance, or were fascinated by dance, but you never had the chance to do that. And as the psychic field expands and begins to vibrate, all this is now begin to free itself. So in no time, you suddenly begin to perform all these movements, either learned, remembered, or in some cases simply memorized from memory how we feel that a dancer would perform. I'm just giving an example, a dancer. You know, like one more particular example was, I don't know whether you will dig it or not, one particular person many years ago, as many as 12, 13 years ago, had these sounds and movements as if he's going on like, you know, like choo-choo train, you know, slow, fire, you know, it's like one meditation, second meditation, one immersion, second immersion, like, where is the guy going? Like, you know, what is the next stop? Like, could be like that. I mean, we're laughing, but it wasn't fun. The guy was just like, you know, gosh, I would have, where is the next stop, you know? So it's good to know and good to understand, and this is why we do this work, and this is not a clear demarcation line, where the Samavesha is the language of the goddess when she takes over, when it's literally that act, or when it is the freeing of the system of impositions. Its line is very slim. So one of the aspects of this work, one of its therapeutic, let's say, aspects, is to help some of you to simply know when something went into a loop, when something needs to be done to go into the next level, to overcome that. Because otherwise it can be as a loop for a prolonged period of time. When it comes to a matter of consciousness, it doesn't even matter how many years. It doesn't matter. When something as subtle and as profound as our consciousness, it matters very little from the consciousness standpoint of view how long you've been doing that. You have to get that. So if from that kind of human perspective, I've been doing it for 5 years, or people, you know, I've been doing it for 10 years, man, I'm done with it. I'm like up to here. You know what? Consciousness doesn't give a damn. It can do it for another 100 years. You know, if the body lasts that long, it will do that. So this, you see, where a line cannot be easily, clearly drawn. Or line is more like drawn on the sand. You know, if you've seen how lines are drawn in the sand, in a real desert, where you drew the line, and you look out, you look away, where's that line? That's why they say, line in the sand, that expression. That's where that expression comes from. Because that's unreliable line. Each time one needs to make adjustment, unique, pertinent to any particular situation. You can't have the shablon, you cannot have one size fits all. Even though there are some, let's say, what observed more systematically, clinically, and once we have enough, let's say, material, we can begin to implement that where it will feel justifiable.